Today, we're talking about machine learning and the potential it has for violent conflict forecasting. According to the University of Cambridge, the first fossil record we have of intergroup violent conflict is the Nataruk Massacre. The fossil evidence found in Kenya dates these prehistoric nomadic hunter-gatherers to around 10,000 years ago, and the skeletons they found have evidence of arrow wounds, blunt force trauma, and broken bones. Since violent conflict seems to be an unfortunate characteristic of humanity, it's only natural for us to wonder, can we ever prevent it? Or at least predict it? I am very excited to dive into this paper. It gives us an overview of the space, the history of trying to quantify conflict, and the technical and geopolitical challenges that stand in the way of making violent conflict forecasting a reality. Here to talk to us are two of the authors, Kayla Huang and Ezra Sharpe. Kayla and Ezra, thank you so much for joining us to discuss your paper. Before we dive into the details of the paper, I'd like to start just by kind of understanding how you both got into this space. So, Ezra, I'll start with you. Your undergrad is in geography, right? Talk to us a little bit about your journey into this intersection of technology and governance.
Yeah, sure. So I imagine it's probably quite unconventional to go from geography, which is, I guess, a social science, into machine learning because they're drastically different. So just to sort of sum up what I did in my undergraduate degree, I found it really theoretical, and a lot of it was dealing with abstract concepts. And one thing I became interested in throughout those 3 years was the philosophy of science. So I took a few modules on it, and the things which really interested me was the distribution of scientific knowledge, the scientific method, and competing theories. And after that, I essentially wondered how that could be applied to social science theories. And one thing which particularly interested me was peace. So put simply, how could we think about peace in a scientific way was a question I was trying to think about, because peace is something we all talk about. It's sort of a normative concept which underpins, for example, the United Nations, but no one really knows what it means scientifically. How do you operationalize it? Apart from diplomacy, which is not very scientific. So I was trying to think about ways we could do that. So I decided to research it through machine learning, and my research last year morphed quite a lot. Me and Kayla did a lot of projects together, and eventually I settled on natural language processing because it struck me with a technical question, which is, can models be trained to learn linguistic patterns and essentially identify incorrectness? And it was also a political question, which is, why are people vulnerable to believing disinformation in the first place? And what's actually the politics of disinformation? Why are people readily available to believe nonsense, essentially? And that's often because in the information space, there's a political vacuum. So for me, that sort of straddled the divide of my political interests and also solving it in a technical way.
Now, Kayla, you are in your undergrad, you're finishing your undergrad at Harvard. What drives your interest in that space?
I actually started as an applied math major, and then I went to
Okay.
CS and statistics, and then I went to CS and government. So that happened over the course of 2 years. So most of the time I've been doing CS and government. There are a lot of reasons for that change. I think some of it is similar to Ezra. Most of the problems I'm personally interested in are not technical, but I really enjoy doing technical work. So that kind of naturally leads me to want to apply some of these more technical methods into social spaces.
All right. So now focusing on this paper, The Promise of Machine Learning in Violent Conflict Forecasting. What's the motivation for this paper?
I'm happy to start here. I don't want to speak on behalf of the other two. I know Max isn't here, the third co-author, but in my view, the motivation was fairly simple. It was um, essentially trying to remove the fog behind this idea of predicting wars with machine learning, which to many people sounds overambitious, techno solutionist, and in our view, it's realistic and it's possible. And we wanted to show people how that's done. So we essentially wanted to give a broad brush overview of what's already happened in the field, what's currently happening, and what needs to happen in the future in order to progress. And then the final question is, so what? So we wanted to sort of plant the seed in whoever reads our paper, hopefully potential researchers, to actually think about this in a serious way. And it's not some far-flung abstract idea anymore, and that it's actually a tangible reality. And as we discussed in the paper, a lot of the bottlenecks we outline require concerted effort to solve. So getting lots of different researchers from different backgrounds together, open sourcing data. And in order to do that, people need to be aware that this technology actually has potential. Otherwise, there just won't be concerted effort. Final factor, I think, which personally motivated me to help write this paper was just removing the fear factor. I think when you hear the title, The Promise of Machine Learning for Violent Conflict Forecasting, it sounds like perhaps we're suggesting some autonomous robotic technology, and we're not. It's always important to us that we're suggesting loud and clear explainability, interpretability, and creating a sort of ontology on how humans and machines manage decision making together. So obviously we end on the note that there's lots more work to be done, but that was the key motivation for me. And yeah, I'm interested to hear what Kayla has to say as well.
Yeah, very, very similar points. I think I come at it from a perspective that this is just a subset of data driven decision making. I think having spent time in the federal government, not necessarily in spaces where these kinds of decisions are being made, it does surprise me sometimes how little quantitative information is used. Obviously, I don't have full purview. This is not a blanket statement, but I think, especially as a young person who's very excited about technology, being able to talk about how this might be salient for some of the very real and very concerning issues that we see in the world is something that I'm excited to bring attention to. I also think the space, we'll talk about this probably later, but the space is very small. If you spend a few days really digging into these papers, you'll see the same few names come up again and again, and they're doing great work. But I think there's a lot of potential for more people to contribute to the field, especially as it's developing.
Yeah, in this paper, you're not doing any experiments, you're not presenting, obviously, then any empirical findings, but I would say it's sort of an explanation of the problem space and then a call to the community at large, the technical community, like, hey, this is the problem space, these are the technical challenges and the sociopolitical challenges. How could we improve on data set quality and interpretability? So give us the main technical challenges that you pull out in the paper, as well as the considerations then for policy implementation.
Sure, I can start more so on the technical side. So throughout the paper, we have main two sections where we're addressing the technical history and also the bottlenecks. I think the bottlenecks are very important, but just to kind of set the scene, we're very specifically talking about conflict forecasting here, which we want to identify as a separate problem from conflict modeling. So, conflict modeling is specifically identifying the causal relationships between a set of features and the result, whether that's violence or a binary peacetime, wartime kind of classification. And conflict forecasting is more so a means to look at the anticipation of violence. So, more forward looking. Obviously, these are very closely related. You cannot forecast without understanding some causal relationship between the world and the outcome. But we're focusing on conflict forecasting. There's a lot of very good, especially like qualitative work around conflict modeling that this field draws on. So, forecasting studies have been done. We kind of go over this more in detail, but in several waves throughout history, starting from the 1960s. But more recently, probably around the late 1990s until now, has really seen a large boom in conflict forecasting research. And this is specifically because some large data sets like UCDP or ACLID were made available. So it just wasn't really possible before then to have any sort of detailed modeling on the fatality level. It was instead like, did a war happen in this country? And that wasn't as productive, which we can dig into if we're interested. So, over the last, especially decade, there's been a lot of work on using many different methods. So, one particularly popular one is random forest. I think that's very interpretable. You can see exactly what decision is being made due to what covariate. And there's a lot of obviously linear regression models that have been around for a long time. RAM models were an early, obviously language based method. So I won't go too into detail about the results for all of these, but in the last couple of years, probably around 3 to 4, what's really interesting is people have been, very few people, but some people have been trying more deep learning methods. So LSTMs, RNNs, now in the last 2 years, transformers, using transformers as a time series model, looking at these problems from that angle. So these are all very exciting. They definitely have their pros and cons, but I will say the main issue in this field is what you are predicting. So there are several different levels. There's the classification problem, either 0 or 1. Is there a war in this country? Is there not a war in this country? That's not really as popular now, because I think predicting the onset of something is a lot more difficult than predicting how something is going to change. And in my personal opinion, I think if you're trying to predict the onset of something, you should probably leave that to the people on the ground, case officers, whatever you want to call them. And then another type of prediction is count data. So like how many fatalities are going to happen in this region in a specific time. So the issue there is wars are rare. So I mean, we know this. Most countries, most of the time, are not experiencing war. So rare data is hard to predict. A lot of times, wars, conflicts, whatever, include black swan events. That's also very hard to predict. And when you're looking at count data, most of the time, when you're looking at fatalities, your data is going to be pretty zero inflated. And so it's pretty hard to model something that is only positive and has a lot of zeros. So it's a very specific field of work. And not even counting the issues around the actual real form of the data, most data is the quality is questionable. And this is
Yeah.
not any sort of comment on who is collecting the data. It's just very hard, obviously, to measure how many people are, subject to violence in a particular time period, especially in a war zone. There's a lot of other issues we bring up in the paper that I'll go quickly through. Some countries have a lot of missing data. And there's also reporting bias. Obviously, a lot of this information is taken from news media, and international news media may not focus on a country in a specific time period for whatever reason. News media might not focus on rural cases of violence and may focus more on urban cases of violence. And obviously, there's also significant opportunity for duplication of these death counts. So there's a lot of questions around data quality. But I'll hand it off to Ezra to talk a little bit about why we're still sort of positive in this field.
Yeah, and just to give some examples, because I think examples always help translate something. On the reporting bias, for instance, one thing we discussed in the paper was there's two comparable data sets on conflict data. Both were looking at civilian deaths in Mexico in 2021, and there was a discrepancy of 6,000
Right.
deaths between the two data sets because one data set made a methodological decision to include unnamed militias and one didn't. And when you're feeding that into a model, that can obviously create vast hallucinations and potentially change the output which is produced from the model. So that's an example of a methodological discrepancy. And on duplication, one thing just from personal research, which is interesting in that space, is I know Kayla said I was going to be positive, but it's important to outline is disinformation, right? Because it's not only duplication of information. So the technology, for example, dealing with semi-structured and unstructured data, so documents, social media, text-based data, is improving in terms of parsing it, recognizing similarities in text. But disinformation is contaminating the space massively. And for example, when a certain information space is flooded with disinformation on a certain topic, it could be electoral information, for example, and you're trying to normalize your data. So in text normalization, you might do sort of like a weighted frequency matrix based on the number of words in a specific document. And if that document's contaminated or repeated multiple times, the significance in the model will be entirely distorted. And the interpretable insight is the importance of the conflict trap, which hopefully we'll discuss in more detail later. But that, put simply, is the idea that once a country spills into conflict, it's very hard for them to escape. And so, sort of alluding to Kayla's earlier point, it's important that a country or a model can predict not only the start, but changes in a continuation of conflict. And that's where the conflict trap is important. So I guess that's the more positive aspect of where these models have actually already produced some really key insights.
It's difficult to pull apart conflict modeling from conflict forecasting because the interpretability part, the why behind the uh, the conflict, seems more to me in line with the conflict modeling, right? The patterns that lead to conflict in an area. So how should we think about that connection between the interpretability of conflict forecasting models with the concept of conflict modeling?
Yeah, this is actually, so I do a little bit of research at this at Lincoln Lab, and the question there we think about a lot is, and we can also address this later if this is of more interest, but a lot of these models consider conflict forecasting as a global problem. And the reason I think we talk a lot about dynamic elastic net is because it's one of the only submissions to this call for papers that uses any sort of country specific mechanism. And so I think, to your point, conflict forecasting is not always interpretable, and thus it doesn't always have to do with the literature around conflict modeling. Certainly, I think dynamic elastic net is contributing to the questions that conflict modeling research asks, as in what is relevant to this country, why is what is happening. But this is not always true, and sometimes there is a trade-off between interpretability and accuracy, especially in such a sensitive area of work.
Also, based on the former idea of political will, I think that's where the key difference between conflict modeling and conflict forecasting lies. So, in my view, conflict modeling is only focused on the heuristic function, which we outline is extremely important. So, understanding what are the drivers of conflict. But I think forecasting is just a bit more forward looking in purpose. So, it's trying to generate decisions, it's trying to influence political will. And so, I think conflict modeling is more constrained to academia potentially, and conflict forecasting has a heuristic function, but to aid policy making decisions.
I also have another quick interjection there around the difference. So there's a organization called the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. They run the views competition around once every 2 years. So dynamic elastic net, along with some other papers that we cite in our paper, were submitted for that competition. So in this competition, they wrote a report afterwards, just talking about what they found after evaluating these, I think, 13, I don't actually remember how many models, but a lot of the times in these sorts of models, the past is the best predictor and is one of the only significant predictors. So the past being like the fatality counts for the last year, or the fatality counts for the last 3 years, or even just the last few months. So there is a question around, is what we're trying to correlate with the outcome even relevant, like crop prices or birth rates, etc.? If in a lot of these models, what they found was that the past fatality count was the most relevant aspect of this model. So there are certainly questions around conflict modeling and how it applies to conflict forecasting.
All right, and let's just go there since we've mentioned it a couple of times, and then we can backtrack. But so DynENet is one of the models that you pull out in the paper. It's not your model, but I think it's worth discussing briefly because it is trying to achieve, or it does to some extent achieve that balance between accuracy and interpretability that you do discuss as one of the major technical challenges in the paper. Kayla, you already kind of alluded to it. It's a country specific approach. Can you just explain a little bit more on the approach of DynENet?
Yeah, absolutely. So we wrote this paper when the second views competition was not out yet. So there are some interesting models in the second competition as well that kind of try to balance interpretability and accuracy. But this one specifically particularly stood out to us because of what it does on this sort of axis. So for those who know, it's basically just elastic net. This is a type of regularization method that combines elements of lasso and ridge regression. So it's both L1 and L2 penalties. And this, importantly, it allows the model to retain the most important variables, which is what a lasso regression usually does. And it also accounts for the correlation between variables, which is what ridge regression does. So it kind of combines these two approaches to enhance both the predictive power and the interpretability of the model. And to kind of zoom out a little bit, DynENet uses more kind of features and covariates than some of the other models in the competition. They have, I believe, around 700 scraped from Google Scholar, I think also Wikipedia, they've basically added a lot of their own features and just grown the feature space so that their model can come in and shrink that space for specific countries. So the model selects particular features for each country that it's considering is the TLDR. And in this way, it's dynamic, which is why it's called dynamic elastic net, and it's more interpretable because you can see they have these visualizations in their final paper of for this country, these were the features that were important. And so you can kind of pick apart why a decision was made about the future.
How are forecasting models trained?
Depends. For example, in the views competition, they're provided this large data set with fatalities and a bunch of other covariates, and people can submit models trained on any subset of this information. For this case, in the views competition, for example, they cut every year. So if you want to forecast 2019, you would cut at October of 2018 and use all of the data before then to train a model. I'd assume that some of these submissions are actually cutting before that and using one set of data as training and one set of data as validation or testing or both. And so it also depends on whether or not you're treating the problem as a classification problem, a regression problem, or a time series problem. So most of the methods that are out there you can apply to conflict forecasting just as you would to any other set of data. I think the addendum there is when you're considering like spatial relationships, that requires a little bit more of nuance. I think that's not as commonly done as maybe it should be because it's just hard. And this is getting really in the weeds, but ACLID versus UCDP code their events to different geospatial fallbacks when they don't have a specific location. So I don't remember which one is which, but one of them goes to the centroid of the specific place that they're looking at, and one of them chooses the nearest large city. So based on which data set that you're using, you'll have different types of bias. So spatial data is very hard to use when you have so much noise. So that's a very long answer. It's the TLDR is also mostly trained how you would train model on any other data with some concerns about the special nature of how this data is collected.
And I guess that's what I'm trying to get at, because you do spend a lot of time talking about, and you mentioned it in your overview, is the problem with data set quality, whether it's misinformation, reporting bias. So when we talk about event-based data and the data, what kind of data are we talking about? And in the historical overview that you provide in the paper, I think it's in the like 2010s that you talk about sort of this shift in focus to localized, you have it, localized indicators and data sources. So what kind of data is that? Where are you getting the data from?
Over the last, particularly decade, there have been a lot of projects popping up that are concerned with conflict forecasting. For example, two of the, I'm going to butcher their names, Mueller and Rao, that we talk about a lot in the paper, they have started their own conflict. It's called conflict forecast. So there are all these different types of early warning systems. Some of them collect their own data and some of them don't. So the main two that I'll focus on are ACLID and UCDP because they're the most commonly used, at least now in conflict forecasting. You're very right to question like what is the actual data because it's very hairy. Basically, both UCDP and ACLID scrape the news, all different sorts of like textual sources to identify events. And these sorts of events are different based on which group you're looking at. So, just to make a little bit more clear what the difference is, most of the time you're going to get a higher death count from ACLID than you are going to get from UCDP. And like Ezra mentioned, some of them are hugely different. And it really depends on the nature of the conflict. For example, UCDP has a very strict definition of conflict events. So it requires at least one fatality and the involvement of one named organized actor. It kind of leaves out, this is something that's brought up by somebody who really digs deep in the difference between these. It's Eck, I believe. And she brings up that UCDP, for example, misses a lot of terror groups like Boko Haram that operate primarily through non-fatal terrorist techniques. And this is more captured in ACLID. So ACLID has a much looser definition of, obviously fatalities are fatalities, but they have a much looser definition of events.
Okay.
And so it's kind of just, you know, something that has to do with brutality in something that has to do with a civil war.
Okay.
Obviously, this is not how we define it, but it's a lot looser.
Right.
So both of them go through this like triple checking process, and it's human coded. So it's a huge undertaking. And they basically, I don't think they look at the same sources per se, one to one, but they're looking at text based sources to try to extract events. But the way they determine which events to include in their final count is very different. So you'll get very different metrics for some places. For example, looking at this in like my other research, the in the Congo, the difference between these two sources is not that big, whereas in South Sudan, the difference is huge. And there are probably a wide variety of reasons why. But what that means for conflict forecasting is most people pick one as a ground truth and just go with that because there's no alternative really.
Now, is that good? Is it good to have these varied definitions of what is considered violent conflict, or is a standardized method? Because I guess a standardized method, you risk losing out on some of these other broader definitions of violent conflict. But having these two different data sets seems like it complicates things.
Yeah, this is completely my personal opinion, but having used both of these data sets, I use UCDP right now as my ground truth
Okay.
just because it's tighter and cleaner. But I very much see the value of ACLID, especially when maybe you're considering specifically protest related incidents. So I think ACLID is very useful just in a general sense, maybe not specifically, it's not specifically made for conflict forecasting. I mean, neither is UCDP, but I think UCDP is, in my perspective, a little bit more appropriate for conflict forecasting, and ACLID is more generally appropriate for trying to look at any sort of political violence.
I think also dimension reduction is incredibly important in this conversation because competing models can sort of be used to plug each other's gaps. So this is potentially where I might disagree with Kayla. But one example I always come to, which we discussed in the paper, is that in the Congo, one data set, for example, used sort of like a coagulation technique where there's multiple different militias and they grouped some similar ones with
Right, yeah.
sizes under one name. And actually, when conflict was attributed to these militias, half of them was potentially responsible, half of them not involved in the outburst of violence at all. And that can obviously cause huge attribution problems and create risks for people who aren't
Involved.
even merely involved in the conflict. So in that sense, I think having two different models or two different databases which use different dimension reduction techniques is important because they can use to sort of plug the gaps of the decisions made in the other models. So, for example, if ACLED used a more granular approach than that, it could be used to aid the interpretability of the model that grouped the militias together.
Then you make the point in the paper with these forecasting models is determining what single outcome variable to predict and who makes that
Yeah,
determination, and is a single outcome variable limiting?
yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. You can cut me off at any time. There is recently, actually, obviously, my universe of context around this is heavily skewed towards these competition because it's just like the main Goliath here in this space, in my view. But I think they're a good example of how the thinking on this has shifted over time. So in their 2020 to 2021 forecasting challenge, they used the change in fatalities as the target variable. And that it was because what I said before around like the issue around zero counts, it becomes difficult. Some models like are not just constrained to the positive range. Um, but in the 2023-2024 challenge, they changed it. They changed it to just the absolute counts. And they talk a lot about it in their own white paper that people can look at. But I think this captures the ongoing discussions about optimal methods for forecasting conflict dynamics because I think, absolute fatality counts provide a direct measure of conflict intensity and it's clearly interpretable, while change metrics are indicating escalation or de escalation, but they don't really project or represent the true severity of conflicts. And it's sometimes not beneficial to only be looking at the change. And there's also discussion around whether a point prediction is better or a distribution is better. And this ties very closely also into how important evaluation is. Many people who listen will know that mean squared error is highly, highly influenced by outliers. And that's not very helpful when all you have is outliers, basically, in conflict forecasting. So I think people are becoming more and more critical of using MSE as the target evaluation metric. And thus, in the 2023 competition, for example, they've introduced this like continuous rank probability score, CRPS, that kind of compares a distribution against each other. Because you could theoretically have mean squared error be very similar for two different distributions and have the CRPS be very different, because everything in this field, especially when you're trying to use it for policymaking, is going to be probabilistic. So it doesn't really make sense to be giving these like models that have point predictions. Many of these are like not reflective of the actual accuracy. So I'm also personally more partial to doing distributional evaluation. And I'll also give one example from this paper that we cite in our paper by Masuba et al. And basically talks about the importance of performance metrics, because in their paper, they talk about how if the performance metric is recall, that is, you care about minimizing false negatives, then the best algorithm is the gradient boosted tree. But if you consider precision, which is minimizing false positives, or the F1 score, then the MLP algorithm is the best model. And I don't actually know how different these two models are in what they predict, but that's pretty concerning, especially in a field where all of these metrics are, there's no ground truth. So what you select is going to dictate what you get, and it's a very important thing to consider.
Right. Now, do you think that there are certain models that are better suited to this space than others?
My personal perspective, especially considering like dynamic elastic net and interpretability, is that there is obviously, everyone would have heard, if we have a model that is really good at predicting the onset of violence, and we don't have a very good model for this, and it's not surprising at all given the quality of the data, the nature of the problem. In my perspective, it is not really a question of how good our models are, and it's more a question of how good the data is.
Okay.
And in that perspective, obviously you have to create a performant model before you care about interpretability, because otherwise, what are you interpreting? I think, in my personal opinion, that we don't talk about this paper as much. The future of conflict forecasting will be based on language processing and text based methods, which we can talk about more later. But I'm curious to see what you think as well.
Yeah, on the text-based models as well, I agree. But the problem still sort of plaguing I guess it's more of the unstructured text modeling. But for example, STM models have some of the lowest interpretability out of any machine learning models you can think of, because when we reduce dimensions and it categorizes text into different themes, there's pretty much no way you can trace back how it's done that apart from the bag of words approach. And trying to communicate that to a policymaker isn't necessarily the most interpretable way of modeling, at least text-based approaches. I have some favorites, one which we talk about in the paper, and I can go into more detail on this just because I think it's sort of an outlier in the trend of, it's not a regression-based model called CogSolve, and it's actually trying to model more of the soft side of conflict. So it's not really looking at fatality data, binary scores. It's actually trying to model the diplomacy of conflict prevention, which I personally just find very interesting. So it sort of integrates expert knowledge on different sort of cultural specificities. And what I mean by that is, for example, a lot of UN peacekeeping missions have been described in literature as having failed because there is just no sort of cultural awareness or understanding in negotiation processes with, for example, local elites or people like that. And especially because a lot of peacekeeping data is collected from local informants. This is work which really interests me, because if you have a model which can sort of better help you to predict stakeholder outcomes, one, it reduces the potential to endanger local informants when they're communicating information to you. And two, I think it's a bit separated from the pack. So CogSolve can go into more detail because I'm sure it will filter onto the latter parts of the paper, but I think that's really interesting. And it's not necessarily a model, but it's a framework, which again, we talk about, and they're definitely some researchers at the top of the field, but they have a conflict intervention framework. And when we're talking about especially when actually making actionable decisions, reducing the balance between false positive scenarios and false negatives. They basically introduce a framework where you can weight certain decisions based on the travesty of the outcome should it be a false positive. So it will look at the relative size of the conflict data. So, for example, fatality data, population density of cities, and it will use that to weight the severity if you were to make a false positive decision in that case. And I think that's the right step forward in trying to make interpretable decisions. So those are my two favorites.
Can you explain a little bit more about what the conflict trap is? Conflict trap is?
Yeah, sure. It's essentially a social science concept, and it's based on sort of vicious cycles and negative feedback loops where low income countries with potentially weak governance, poor economic development, especially in civil wars, are prone to repeated conflict. It's essentially a complicated academic way of saying violence begets violence. And
Mhm.
it's, again, one of the key insights which has emerged from the conflict forecasting. And for me, the key takeaway from that is it foregrounds the importance of preventative measures. So basically telling us that once a country or a civil war spills over into violence, it's very hard to prevent that from happening in the future again.
Right.
So the sort of like first the first few feet in the negotiation stage or preventative diplomacy, the most important. It underscores the importance of creating bodies and academic projects and funding for data collection. Because again, it's a bit of a trite point, but when a country spills over into war, data collection it goes bottom of the list in terms of priorities, or at least public data collection. Militaries will collect data, but it won't be forecasted publicly to researchers, for example, in academic institutions. And that's a problem. So essentially, once a country spills over into conflict, it can be very difficult to continue forecasting changes in that conflict because a cap is put on the data being produced. There are some antidotes to that, though. So, for example, we've seen with the Russia-Ukraine war the importance of open source intelligence, and I think that's going to be really important in sort of combating those bottlenecks. So, for instance, a lot of people found out about Russia invading Ukraine because pictures of the Z tanks spilling over the border were spread on Twitter by local informants, and that's really important when you're not getting official structured data fed into research bodies that we have people on the ground doing OSINT, SOCMINT, which is social media intelligence. So I think that's a potential antidote. And tying to the point earlier on outliers, noise, and mean squared error, essentially what this tells us as well is that models aren't very good right now at predicting the sort of black swan events. And what I mean by black swan events is events which sort of just spontaneously emerge out of nowhere and it's an unknown unknown. Like there was pretty much no way of a human or a machine knowing it was ever going to happen. So the
Mhm.
2022 Grey Crisis is an example of that. But one thing we also talk about is the Arab Spring, which started with the
Right.
self-immolation of a shop owner in Tunisia. And trying to incorporate noise to predict those kind of events is near on impossible, in my opinion. So it's sort of the conflict trap is important for expectation management, is what I would say.
And while we're on this thread of open source information and information sharing, you discuss in the paper the leaders of different UN peacekeeping operations are hesitant to share information with each other, or it doesn't happen as frequently as people would like it. Am I understanding that correctly? And why is that?
Yeah, that's true. And so there's a few reasons for that. One is ego. So
Okay.
the people at the top of peacekeeping operations, especially if they're not achieving the sort of numbers or the targets they need to be achieving, if a lot of personnel are dying unnecessarily, they don't want to report that and share it with other missions. So that's one. But a lot of the data in the UN SAGE database is based on local informants, and peacekeeping personnel are worried that it could be triangulated back to them.
Okay.
And actually, if local forces find out that people have been informing the UN SAGE database or a peacekeeping mission, it could endanger them. So that's it's definitely an issue. And one thing I'm personally interested in is how reinforcement learning can be used to approach conflict modeling and conflict forecasting. A reinforcement learning model will have a target which it wants to achieve, and it will need the continuous flow of data to constantly correct its previous mistakes. And in order to do that, for example, in the context of a UN peacekeeping mission, you would need to share data between peacekeeping operations in order to constantly improve them through a reinforcement learning based approach. So open source is critical here.
Yeah, there's also just since this is super relevant because it's from a peacekeeping mission, I think UN peacekeeping missions are an example of who should be relied on to kind of predict the onset of things. As Ezra was alluding to, black swan events, I'm of the strong belief that conflict forecasting models should not be used to predict these sorts of events. I think the quintessential example is the genocide facts from Rwanda in January of 1994. That was somebody who was heading up a UN assistance mission and knew exactly what was going to happen in the place that he was overseeing, and was very adamant that he knew something that was going on that people in the UN weren't recognizing. So I think that shows like a lot of things, both how aware people on the ground are of what's about to happen. This is not obviously an isolated example. We see this in the last few years with the Sudanese reinflation of tensions as well. People were very aware of what was happening on the ground before something was happening officially. And I think this is just a broad warning that I wouldn't personally advocate for any sort of model to replace that on the ground kind of recognition. But also, I think that incident demonstrates kind of a failure on the UN's part to really heed those warnings. So it's a two-sided.
And just to feed off that as well, sorry,
No, that's
the
okay.
Rwanda case is really interesting because I think especially the 1994 Rwandan genocide, I know it was decades ago, but it shows us that we haven't got even the conflict trap forecasting correct yet. And what I mean by that is all the forecasts were there for policymakers to know that Rwanda was about to spill over into ethnic-based violence. All the forecasts were there. It's in UN documents, reports, Human Rights Watch, and policymakers decided not to act on it. And that's for lack of political will. It's geostrategy and all these sorts of factors which feed into decisions. So if we can't, if the model generates the right output, correctly influence policy, we shouldn't be focusing on trying to predict unknown unknowns when even when we have known unknowns, we can't get that to influence policy correctly.
Right. Okay, that's a good point. So, Kayla, your last point, I think, connects with your preference for language-based models, right?
Yeah. So I think, the three examples that I have off the top of my head are the genocide facts in 1994. People talking about, oh, we knew Khartoum was about to experience something horrible in 2023. And then going all the way back to the blood telegram in Bangladesh right before their liberation war in 1971. That spans decades of evidence that I think it's obvious to me that people on the ground know what's going to happen before anything happens. But I think that ties more so towards my belief that because conflict is such a like both a stochastic process and very complicated, influenced more and more now as time goes on by more and more factors like foreign influence, climate change, social media disinformation. I think a lot of these relationships that we don't have an understanding for is captured implicitly in textual data. I think, for example, if you want to measure rising ethnic tensions, you're not going to look at reports that are on a time lag of 6 months, trying to assign a quantitative value to something that is so nebulous and hard to capture. And I think it's obvious to me that some of these factors that affect modern conflicts, particularly like foreign influence, are maybe better captured on social media and news media than they are on any sort of official reporting. And I'm not saying that OSINT is going to eat the world, but I certainly think that there is a lot of potential there to use text based evidence to try to make inferences about things that you might not even fundamentally understand. And I also think like I'm more partial, obviously, towards textual information because of the last 2, 3 years of development in language models. I don't think language models can be used themselves as predictors, but I certainly think that they can be leveraged for summarizing, identifying important factors. Even like embeddings can be used to cluster different sorts of like patterns in the past. So as with Mueller and Rao, who have, been publishing on this even this year, they're doing like they've always been the ones who have been driving this sort of text-based approach. They've come out with their own like 6 million document large database around this.
Ezra, did you want to add on? Because you also mentioned something similar.
Yeah, my focus is very much on the disinformation space, and I guess this is a clarion call to other researchers. But we've seen with, for example, the recent mushrooming of LLMs that a lot of text-based models scrape billions of data points. And when you're doing that, it's very difficult to sort of discriminate in the ingestion process. And what that means is the data is not airtight. And with text-based data, it's important to try and keep it as airtight as possible, especially when you're conflict forecasting. So my fear, and an area of research which has to improve if we're going to use text-based data, is disinformation tagging. So trying to identify structural or linguistic patterns which can differentiate, or I guess intended disinformation or accidental misinformation. But what's important is it's the scale of the data will be too large for humans to do it. And if we can't do that, it will be very easy for an adversarial actor to completely flood and contaminate a text-based environment and hallucinate a model. And so that's my suggestion or plead to other researchers to really take an interest in this area.
The heuristic function that you end the paper with, maybe we can have models that accurately forecast conflict, but we can definitely gain something from our continued exploration of trying to create models that accurately forecast conflict. Can you talk a little bit about what we stand to gain from that work?
Yeah, so in terms of trying to quantify the impacts, at least, there's so many things which we stand to gain from this. I could list them, but for example, fewer countries spilling into war, understanding the drivers of conflict, especially to do with trying to synergize different research avenues, I think will be really interesting. So conflict models with climate-based research will be fascinating to see how different sort of emission scenarios change the potential for wars in different areas of the globe. Other things we stand to gain, I mean, in the context of UN peacekeeping operations, which is something I'm quite interested in because that's where it's actually been employed on the ground, is to be very specific things like troop placement, predicting different threats, soft resolution, even things like landmine detection using geospatial imagery now, and computer vision technology is fascinating because now they're trying to integrate into models things which the human eye can detect. So for example, buried landmines, if we can integrate that into a conflict forecasting model, that would save thousands of lives. So that's really important.
All right. And then who do you think should read this paper? Who would you like to read this paper? Who would benefit from reading this paper? I'll start with Kayla and then go back to Ezra.
I wouldn't say that we kind of want it to be geared towards the technical audience, but I think the goal here is not to draw somebody who's very deep into their own technical research to like, oh, shift gears and this is exactly what we should be considering now. I think especially for people who have their own line of research, I think this is hopefully just like an interesting insight into how two fields can cross over. But I'm personally hoping more so that people who are interested in quantitative tools in politics, in government, in diplomacy, can kind of look at this and see this as a promising field. People who are looking for direction for research in this field can view this as a place where they should be putting in some effort and giving some pointers as to where to start. I think this is maybe more for an audience that is either vaguely working on something related or thinking about what to work on in this space.
Ezra?
Yeah, and I think fundamentally, all three of us represent who we hope to read the paper,
Okay.
which is interdisciplinary people. For me, that's really important. So, for example, we've discussed throughout this hour the importance that of domain knowledge in different model inputs. So, for example, CogSolve relying on people with specific linguistic knowledge or ethnographic knowledge, anthropologists, people like that inputting knowledge on specific places and people into a model is really important. And so that's partly why I hope why it's published in Data for Policy. It's not solely a machine learning journal,
Right.
it's an interdisciplinary journal. And we're trying to sort of outreach to those kinds of people, experts who can help embellish the field, I guess, is what we're trying to achieve, because so many of the models still rely on specific domain knowledge. And I don't think we can neglect that.
So, lastly, what is coming up for each of you? Are there exciting research papers or works that we can look forward to coming out?
I've been trying to use pretty rudimentary methods to see if language models can be helpful in this context. This is what I'm working on at the Lincoln Lab because one of their groups, the Humanitarian Aid and Disaster Response Group, has a grant about how LLMs can help in this specific area. I have some caveats there. I don't think LLMs should be thrown at every single problem. Hopefully, something interesting comes out of that. I have some preliminary results that are kind of promising. We'll see. But I'm definitely still interested in working on this space and probably will be doing so in some vague capacity for a bit.
Yeah, Kayla and I have some research which we've yet to sort of mature into something ready for a paper, but we did do some projects together based on electoral disinformation in the US that we created from the previous election. Well, the 2018 one. No, 2016, sorry. But that was super interesting. And essentially our results failed, but the failed results actually told us something more interesting than potentially a result which told us that you could forecast it, which is fundamentally that you have to do it on a topic by topic basis, because we tried the generalist approach, which was filtering in topics from Biden's health to Trump's legal cases to the Russia and Ukraine war, and actually confused the model totally. So that was fascinating.
Yeah, thank you, Kayla and Ezra, again for joining and talking to us about this very interesting intersection of domains of technology and governance. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It's a joy to talk to you
Thank
about
you for
it.
having us. It was